Welcome to Growing Up with AI, where I speak to parents who work in AI around how they think about the technology in the context of their kids. Today, I'm really glad to be joined by Matt Strain, who is the founder of Prompt.ai. You've been in the tech world for a long, long time. How do you explain to your kids what it is that you do?
So for the longest time, my kids really had no real understanding of what I did. But I guess the last 17 years in the corporate world, I was at Adobe. So at least with that, they could see some of the tools and some of the creativity related things that I did. And I've had a chance to do different things over the years. So I explained marketing to them early on with what I was doing, and they saw that through a limited lens. I went away during the day and I came back. My last role at Adobe, when I was in the research lab, I would come back and show them some cool new technology. And I think they enjoyed that a little bit. And then more recently, when I've been in the AI world, I've tried to show them some tips and tricks and ways to use AI. And one of the things I think we'll get into is in a lot of cases, they were very unimpressed and saw AI as almost a way of cheating, or they were not as impressed with it as I thought they were going to be.
So you mentioned that you've worked at Adobe for 17 years. You've also spent 10 years at Apple. So you've been in Silicon Valley and in the tech industry for a long, long time. And therefore, surely you must have seen quite a lot of hype stuff. Where do you feel like the current conversation around AI compares to some of those other hype cycles that we've had in the past?
I think it's very similar to what we went through here in the dot-com phase. And I think what a lot of people don't understand about a cycle like this and how the investment community works is that there are a lot of companies that are funded, and the intention going into it is that not all those companies are going to succeed. So I think when a company goes out of business or a startup doesn't make it, that's not necessarily because the idea was a bad one, but it's because there are 10 or 20 other companies doing the same thing, and it's essentially survival of the fittest. So I think sometimes that is misinterpreted as hype. I'm a big believer that AI is going to be here and is going to continue. I think there's a lot of question about what do the companies look like that are going to succeed. So I don't think it's so much hype as it is just a misunderstanding of how this part of the business process works. And I think a lot of people who haven't been exposed to the venture community assume that if a VC invests in a company, they have a high degree of confidence that it's going to succeed, as opposed to the fact that they're placing a strategic bet that if it does succeed, it's going to be huge, but a certain number of their portfolio just are not going to make it.
So you mentioned the word AI a couple of times, and Forbes even called you an AI whisperer. What do you mean when you say AI?
I think it's a very misunderstood term. To me, it's really when computers are trying to emulate what people do, right? So at the highest level, there's Gen AI, there's AI that's been around since the late 50s. But I'm really talking about it where, technology and computer comes in and starts to emulate or replace what people have traditionally done. The thing that people miss is AI has been around for a long time, right? At Adobe, we had technology that would synthesize voice about 8 or 9 years ago, right? There were a number of reasons, mostly in terms of concern about how it could be misused, that I think a lot of the big companies didn't release it. So in many ways, we've been using AI as just regular people throughout the day without really knowing it was AI because it was integrated into other things.
It feels at the moment that you can't run a software organization without having to promise AI and everything. And you've had roles across marketing and strategy. What is the differentiation right now between where is AI just marketing versus where is it actually a real strategic direction shift that organizations are going into?
Yeah, I think there's a tremendous amount of marketing, and I think that's where the hype comes in, right? And it's been interesting. So I've gone into a number of companies that when I look at their website, they have AI all over it. And then I sit down and talk with them, and it's all marketing copy, right? Or
Yeah.
maybe like they're experimenting in a product, but they really don't have it integrated at all. So I think there's a place there where people are talking about AI in an aspirational way
Yeah.
to kind of test it out, but it's not nearly as integrated. And there are reasons for that, right? I mean, I think it's a difficult thing to know how to roll out right now, because one of the things that's happening is it's changing so fast that it's hard to know when to jump in to technology that's moving so fast, because you can be pretty sure that whatever you do today, in 6 months, there will be something that either augments or replaces that, and it may come from a different company. And then you've got to go back and make the bet again. Do you change and base it on a new company? But if you don't do anything, then you're left out. So I think that's where there's a lot of anxiety and sort of trepidation around how do you get started and what things do you do first.
So tell me a bit about like how did that conversation work when you were at Adobe? You mentioned that you had already the capability of synthesizing voice about 10 years ago. You must have been there just at the beginning of when Midjourney and all of these other companies were generating a whole bunch of content. And Was that kind of seen as something, okay, finally we can also ship our own stuff, or was there more of a defensive conversation around like, if that's the case, what is our role within the ecosystem?
So one of the things that has always impressed me about Adobe is they really take sort of responsibility and doing this in a thoughtful way, very important to them. So I think when they saw what was happening with some of these other tools, I mean, it was an opportunity to bring some of it to market. And as you know, the researchers at these companies move between Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Adobe all the time, right? So I think as a large company, there are constraints and concerns that they have. One about, maybe competition with their own products, but I think more of it was really how do you do it responsibly? And how do you make sure that disinformation and deepfakes and misuse isn't going to be a big issue? So I think that's where, particularly with voice cloning, right? So you can imagine where when we got to the point where you could take 20 seconds of someone's voice and synthesize that, the positive uses were great. And a lot of Adobe's customers that were, you know, production studios and things like that, if they had an actor who couldn't come in the next day, gave them approval, they could use the voice, and modify that and save everybody time and effort. So from the core customer base, there are some really good uses, but the misuses are also obvious. So that was one of the things that held them back. And then what I saw what happened with the companies is once, OpenAI and some of the smaller companies that came out of the research labs came into the market, it sort of opened a floodgate, which is why you saw a lot of the smaller companies able to get to market quickly. The larger companies had and still have, I think, a lot of the technology in-house that is just now starting to roll out. And we're seeing that with Google, and other companies like that. And the same thing with Adobe, where they've been kind of waiting to understand what the right way to roll out Gen AI is responsibly. And there's so much internal work that needs to be done to make that happen that we're just now seeing it. And the other thing like with Adobe that was interesting is we had a team that was working on sort of content authenticity. So what's the right way to detect fakes? Was it imaging forensics, or was it, content provenance in terms of tracking and ask through from camera through to production, and where it was changed and how? So
That seems like the cat and mouse game at the moment, is that question around authenticity. Do you feel that we have a sensible chance of actually identifying most stuff that is generated through AI at the moment?
honestly, it's a cat and mouse, and I think it's a losing proposition. I think that companies like Adobe are doing the best that they can. It's now more, if you want to look at an image and interrogate it, you can see where it came from. I think the challenge I see is with the way we're wired as humans, if we see something that reinforces what we want to believe, we're going to believe it. And we're not going to go and ask about it. Plus, there are also certain things that if you see or hear, right, we just believe it, right? Because we're not trained, and I don't know if we're ever going to be trained to think that way. And I had some cases where I lived on a houseboat here in Sausalito, and I took a picture off my deck of people kayaking and pelicans and all this, and I put I compounded like 100 images into one image with like giant pelicans on kayaks and this and that, and I posted it. And people who know I work at Adobe and know my sense of humor are like, "Did that really happen?" I'm like, of course it didn't happen. But people are just such believers in what they see and hear. And I think we're aware, unfortunately, that a lot of what we see we can't trust, which I think is a huge issue.
Yeah.
But hearing as well, right? You hear someone's voice and you believe it, right? I've got a good friend, and the parents were scammed by a voice scammer, who had said that the son had been in an accident. They synthesized his voice and called up and were trying to essentially extract money for bail. And they heard the voice. They had made it sound like the son was crying, which you don't usually hear your son cry. You're flooded with emotion when you hear this. And the story was he had been in an accident and the police were calling and needed money for bail. And they started preparing to get a large amount of money.
Yeah.
And then finally they took a step back and they said, well, maybe we should try calling our son. And they called him, and he was working on his homework at college. So I think it's going to be so hard to stay on top of it, particularly if somebody really has a bad intent at scale. And we're starting to see some of that, unfortunately.
And there's some discussion that maybe Gen AI is beneficial here because we've already lost a little bit of that trust through social networks and for all of the sharing there. And maybe now Gen AI teaches us that you can't trust anything. Do you feel that's realistic? So it's almost like an inoculation around, and we get towards a zero trust approach?
I think there are going to be a small number of people that understand that and who understand technology who will become better critical thinkers. So I think that's really what it's about, right? Is, how do you understand data and critical thinking? I think it's highly optimistic because honestly, if you look at some of the things that people believe that are not grounded in any kind of truth, and I won't verge into politics here, but people believe things where there's very, very little truth, right? And if you look at the science behind that, there are reasons for that. And actually, when I first left Adobe, I was going to go into the fake news and disinformation space, looking at tools and ways to deal with that. And then when I sat back and thought about it, I realized it's more of a critical thinking, a way that we're wired, a bias that comes into confirmation bias and that type of thing. And I realized the solution I don't think is technical. I think the first part of the solution is getting people to think more critically.
Yeah.
And from what I'm seeing in the world, that's a bigger challenge than I'm able to take.
Yeah, I think it's fair. It's probably not a question of technical, it's probably a question of trust more widely in society, right? We're seeing these conspiracy theories go up as we see trust in any kind of profession and each other going down. So maybe technology isn't the right answer to that.
And I think if you look at the World Economic Forum, they have a global risk report, and it's related to what you just said with trust. But one of the top risks that they put in wasn't that we believe things are fake, but it's more that we don't believe anything. So, and it's happening, it may be happening to you as well. But if I go and look in the news now, and if I see an image coming out of, what's happening in the Middle East, or, a flood or something that's taking place, you really don't know where that image came from and who's behind it and how trustworthy it is. So I find myself all the time going in and using AI to ask, is this a real image? Is this a real story? So I feel like I'm having to fact check just about everything that I'm reading. And I found several cases where top publications, have been wrong. And people who I trust and who I've trusted their judgment in the past are forwarding and sending things around that are fake.
That's really interesting that you're saying that this is the case irrespective of the source, because one way that this trust economy could now go is that you say, okay, there's certain sources, I trust that they are set up in such a way, certain publications or whatever, and therefore I need to fact check them a bit less. And what I'm going to do is focus more on fewer sources rather than get quite as wide a opinion.
I think that will happen. And I think, those sources will get better at detecting and reporting things that are real. But even with that, I trust the New York Times, right? And that's one of my go-tos. But, I found a number of times when I dig into an article or I go back to the source, it's not quite represented as even-handedly as I would have hoped it would be. So I think it's asking a lot of people to really spend that time and energy figuring out what a non-biased source is. And I also think that, there's comfort in that community of shared belief, right? So that we may be a place where people like having that emotional connection with things that are grounded in something that might not be quite true. So,
Yeah.
but I do think, which is kind of unfortunate because back in the day, there was sort of the whole citizen journalism world, which I was really excited about. But I think what you're saying, I think the importance of brand in news and trust is going to be more important than ever.
I have this general question around like the importance of brand in the world of Gen AI, not just from a discovery of information, but also in a discovery of content. How will people search if the entrance to a discovery is no longer a search bar, but is much more of an agent that optimizes for some outcome? Kind of curious around whether you had views around there in terms of how does the information ecosystem maybe translate into other industries down the line as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have thoughts. I don't have like concrete answers. And I've had this discussion with a branding agency recently where the idea of an internet that is where many of the things we're buying and the transactions we're having aren't from a website. The idea of having buyer and seller agents, right? Not for everything, but I think for many things that may not require that visual input where if I know your size when you last bought things, how everything fits, what you do, what your hobbies are, your buyer agent, my seller agent could make that match and complete the transaction. So I think that's going to be a world that shifts like the sales process, right? So you think a lot of what Salesforce is based on, the idea of having humans and people reaching out to do sales calls and going through the whole sales process. I mean, much of that could be much more efficiently improved by buyer and seller agents.
So you have a lot of conversations now in your new role around advising companies around what AI could have an impact on them. Are there specific topics that come up with everyone, or is it very dependent on the maturity of the organization and maybe as well the industry that they work in?
A lot of it is really around how do we get started? I think there's a general, what I mentioned before, a concern around what things do we do now, what things are going to evolve over the next 6 or 12 months.
Yeah.
That's the primary area that I'm still working at. So many of the companies I'm working with aren't technical companies; they're non-technical companies. So I've been doing a lot of work in the private equity world, where their portfolio companies might be more traditional companies, and there you get people who are CEOs and C-suite, and they are full up all day just executing and doing their role. So
Yeah.
it's sort of the same thing I think that teachers have, where AI comes on the scene, they have an intellectual understanding of it, but they really don't know viscerally how it works or what it is. So a lot of the work I'm doing is going in and working with senior teams, explaining what AI is at a very high level, both in terms of how it can affect their workflow today. So without being all disruptive, saying, let's look at those things you do today. Let's, from a non-threatening way, figure out how AI can replace some of or augment some of those things that you don't want to do and are repetitive to free up more time so that you can do those things that the company has hired you to do. So reports and processes and so forth.
So you're talking about like efficiency-driven AI usage, doing the stuff that you're doing better and cheaper.
Yeah, that's the first thing, right? And then what are those ways where AI can really accelerate or boost those things that you're doing? And then also, what are those areas that AI is not going to touch, either ever or for a while? Those things that are mostly human, where you want that human to human contact. So that's the first thing I'll do. The next thing is then going in to look at what does AI mean to your business model, your industry? So more preparing for where the larger change could come going forward. And then the fun part of what I do is just sitting down with, senior leadership teams and getting them on ChatGPT, sometimes for the first time, and showing them how you use these tools. Because I think it's really only after you start integrating AI into your day-to-day workflow that you can start to make those leaps in terms of how you can apply it at work. Right. So if you start using it for detecting, like, my plant is sick, right, which it's great at, right? You can now replace your $70 plant app with ChatGPT in the imaging mode. Not completely, but for most of us. So there are things like that that you're like, I can do this in a non-threatening way that isn't going to risk my identity at work. And you sort of build up use cases that way. And then you can move over into the workforce and start saying, okay, I now understand how summarization works, or how I can use a notebook LM to query a larger document. So you have low stakes uses at work. And then from there, you can start working up. So I've met with one private equity firm, and their first question was, and this person hadn't even used ChatGPT. She was asking, how do I use AI to improve executive compensation for our senior leaders? I'm like, do not start there.
Yeah.
Start with lower stakes, understand the technology, and then you can build up to do that. And a lot of it really comes down to what you said earlier around trust, right? So if you think about it as it's a new relationship with this new form of intelligence that we don't fully understand. So by trusting it a little bit, you can sort of understand where it's strong and where it's not, understand those areas where it might, hallucinate. And the other one that people are talking more and more about now is sort of the sycophantic tendencies of AI, where it will come in and it will reinforce what you're asking it. Which, if you don't know it's doing that, right, that can take you down a path where you think you're right, and you need to, like, actively say, challenge me on this, play devil's advocate, and some of those tricks and tips. So I spend part of my time talking about some of the structural workflow issues, but then others really trying to get the team on working it using AI and just understanding where it is today with a view into how it might evolve.
And do you feel, in terms of where this AI stuff is going to go, we live in the future is already here. It's just not an evenly distributed world where everyone will behave in the same way as Silicon Valley? Or do you feel that Silicon Valley ends up being this slightly different view on the world, and therefore actually some of the patterns that are emerging there end up not really cascading down into the rest of the country or the world?
I think it's going to be that. I think there will be a very small number of people who really get it and use it at scale and have tremendous power. I think there will be 10 to 15% of the people who use it daily and use it well. And I think there'll be a lot of people who frankly, are really lagging, or it just doesn't cross their radar, or it scares them. I mean, I was down in Raleigh, North Carolina on Monday and Tuesday this week, talking with some folks. And I was talking about how, everyone in the workforce is going to be thinking about AI and concerned about their jobs. And they're like, nah, that is not the case with a lot of people in a lot of parts of this country. So I realized I'm a little bit out of touch with how much, when I say real people, I mean non-technologists, are concerned about and thinking about AI. Which, it's interesting if you think of, if you think about how concerned many people in the States are about immigrants coming in and taking their jobs, right? They're not nearly as concerned about AI taking their jobs. Where if you look at where the real risk is for a lot of users, that's where I think they're going to see more impact. But so I think there's a very high level of awareness among executives and business owners who are seeing it pop up in the press. But as you move down through organizations, I'm not sure how prevalent that concern is.
I can see, like, a company like Adobe, for them, there's this interesting thing that suddenly everyone can produce pictures by themselves on ChatGPT. And even though they invest into their own models, right, they have, I think, the Firefly family of models, There's a really interesting question around like, are you living the innovator's dilemma problem there? Where while Adobe still owns the professionals, ChatGPT, etc., might come after them at some point, and therefore you need to try and figure out how do you balance this. Do you feel this is true for other industries as well, or do you feel it is really something that will impact the software industry much, much more? And therefore, to a certain extent, Silicon Valley is right to be more concerned about this than the more, the other industries that you might have in South Carolina.
Yeah. So I learned a lot about North Carolina, where it's much more advanced and technical. So I think, but to your point, I think it definitely will affect the tech companies. I'm a believer that companies like Adobe and the established companies that are about creativity will thrive. I think the more people can, once you start hitting that outer limit of your creativity, I think you're going to want more and more. And I think a company like Adobe and some of these others, if they can bring their tools down to the mid-market, there's going to be a huge opportunity. But the question you ask, I think AI is going to hit just about every field out there in every business. I think my thinking has changed on this too. I think the speed at which it's going to affect some of the established businesses is going to be slower than I initially thought, just because people are slow to move. I mean, I'm getting calls from big companies that say, we want to put AI on our agenda for 2026 planning. So could you help us think about how to set this up for our 2026 planning meeting? And I'm like, we're halfway done 2025. AI is picking up speed. You don't have time to wait till the beginning of 2026. But again and again, we have seen that big companies take time to change just with that inertia and their technical debt. But I think we will start seeing small startup companies and people. The one thing I'm seeing, which is interesting, is a lot of fresh grads don't want to go into a company where they're not allowed to use AI, or AI isn't prevalent, because that's, why would they work an extra 2 or 3 hours a day when they don't have to, right? And they're using it responsibly to do better work. So I think we will start seeing the edges of some of these established businesses, or the sort of the fringes starting to be eaten away. And then once there's a certain sort of critical mass of that, I think it's going to start accelerating.
Yeah.
And I think there will be places in a, sort of in an end-to-end pipeline of an ecosystem in an industry where AI is going to move faster than others. But I'm hard pressed to think of an industry where there's not going to be change.
And do you have a sense of where the change will move the fastest? So what are the bellwethers to look out for to see, okay, this is what's going to happen maybe in other places as well?
I mean, I think there's the routine, anything that's procedural and process driven, but that's kind of predictable. We can see where that's going to happen. Like there are examples of companies in their HR department where an HR business partner would have largely been repeating and basing their discussions on manuals and HR policies. So having an HR bot that does that, and IBM rolled one out several years ago that has done, exceptionally well. They replaced a lot of their HR business partners, and they now have a higher level of satisfaction because you can access it, 24 hours a day. It's always updated. Not to say there wasn't value that the people didn't add, but the value of the immediacy and the accuracy has sort of surpassed that individual connection. So I think that's almost to be expected. So in customer service, we've already seen a lot of customer service displacement. So I think that's where the immediate job effect is going to be. I think the surprise is going to be how good AI is at understanding people.
Yeah.
And things that have been the domain where we're like, well, only a person can do that. And when I looked at the research on things like annual job performance reviews, right,
Yeah.
the amount of training that most people have and the satisfaction that most people have about that review process is really poor. And some of the technology that's coming up in being able to analyze peer feedback, construct positive feedback for an employee review, even going back and looking at things like all of your accomplishments for the last year, which, as you know, at a big company, people stress about, how do I write up my accomplishments for the year? Well, if you have access to, your equivalent of Google Drive and all of your emails, AI could easily consolidate the projects you worked on, what your role was, and even how close you were to achieving your KPIs, which would allow somebody to get a huge first step on that, right? And the manager to then, in a non-biased way, analyze, how did Matt do against what we'd asked him to do? So I think there are areas like that we had assumed were the domain of humans, because there are a couple people that do that stuff really, really well. And I've also found that in the world of AI, people hold AI to the bar of like the best possible human they know, where your average, at least in Silicon Valley, and in the tech world, a lot of managers come out of either, like a product background or a technical background, and they want to do what they're doing, especially in the research world. They see their value as either creating things or engineering or researching things and not managing. So I
Yeah.
think that management layer is one that I think we're going to see the biggest surprises in the next couple of years.
It's quite a lot of those examples I would classify them probably still as efficiency examples. I think the bits that are very difficult to predict at the moment is how do value chains move around, right? You talked about selling agents and buying agents, and that's quite disruptive for a lot of retailers who make a lot of their margin based on media selling or something like that. Or how do you see that world play out?
If you look at medicine in the medical field, the research field, the way medical advice and things are delivered, what's interesting with that is, there are examples that are outside of the mainstream where medical consulting and evaluations and some of this actually was also accelerated with COVID too, right? Where how do you deal with remote support and things like that? So I think that's changing faster. My son is actually doing an internship for me right now, and he's looking at the food chain because he's got interest in that, and is looking at where AI fits in with that to make that more efficient. So I think there's some fascinating things that are taking place there. I'm starting to work with a couple law firms, and I think, anything that's hourly based is going to have a significant change. And even where is that value delivered? Because it doesn't necessarily need to come from a person anymore. So I think, the fact that a lot of us have thought of chatbots as like just customer support, I think is going to change dramatically as it, can sort of deliver more intelligence real time. So I think that's there. And I think, so I'm not as deep in the sort of classic supply chain world. But I think, all of those inefficiencies that go back from people, taking time or specs, and because it's the thing with that is many of those supply chains are very standardized, right? The buying and selling relationships are set either in a regulated industry. So I think anything like that, where it's a regulated industry, where things are well documented and there are protocols, all of those are primed to be taken over by AI.
Interesting. You mentioned that your son is doing an internship with you to explore the space. I think one of the things that you mentioned to me beforehand is like, this is partly obviously to help you, but also partly to build his skills, because you weren't convinced that he was necessarily learning all of these AI skills in school. What do you think then we need to do in order to prepare our kids for this new brave world? And that quite challenging time of coming into a new world and having to understand how they can get their first jobs when maybe the expectation has changed surprisingly quickly around what that first job looks like.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. So I would say, if you think about what it is to be a university right now and to be teaching any course, teachers have been traditionally overworked. So they're coming out of COVID, and now they've got AI hitting them, and they're coming up to speed on understanding what AI is, worried about cheating and authenticity in the classroom, and then having to modify their curriculum. So that's a lot for them to do. And what I'm seeing is a lot of teachers, there's some outstanding ones that I've seen, but for the most part, it's hard for a teacher to change that quickly. So in my case, both of my kids came from a liberal arts background, right? So they're not, deep technologists, which I think in many ways is a really important place to come from, because I think curiosity and critical thinking and adaptability is going to be super important in the future. And I think my kids have that, but what they don't have is a really strong relationship with AI. And in some ways, I'm also seeing them, like, that focus on humanity, creates a healthy skepticism with AI. So with my son, he was looking for a summer internship, and I'm like, if you can go find your perfect internship, that's fantastic. I'll be your plan B. So, we actually sat down, part of what I did at Adobe was my team ran a very large intern program. So I came in and I said, let's pick a project that you want to do. We'll get you some basic AI training. Here's some books to read. Here's some courses to take. We'll go through that, and then you'll pick a project to work on. And the project tied into what he was studying. He's getting a business major looking at sustainability and sort of system design. And he picked the food service industry, sort of from farm to table, mapping that out, and then looking at where in there can he apply AI. And at first I'm like, it didn't jump out to me. And then as he's dug into it, there are all kinds of fascinating ways, from the hospitality side to even the server side, but obviously the food chain from farm to table. There are a lot of inefficiencies in there, and looking at where AI can play a role has actually been fascinating for me, and I think for him as well. And we've discovered there a tremendous number of companies that are using both technology in ways that I didn't realize, but also AI.
And so, as someone who's worked in technology for 27 years, how have you been thinking about the use of technology at home? Have you had device and screen limits for your kids?
Yeah. So with the kids growing up, we put them in a Waldorf school, which, as you may know, is particularly through 8th grade, is a very limited screen time policy. And when we were evaluating that, I actually did a lot of research, and both on sort of brain development and cognitive and emotional development. And I'm really glad that we went down that path. And what's interesting is in Silicon Valley, there are a lot of Silicon Valley employees and executives that have done the same thing, right? We'll be working in tech during the day, but in terms of like allowing the kids on screen time and social media are really limiting that. But the logic behind it was down the path of, one, believing that if multisensory education is a positive thing. So if you're writing, if you're using your hands, if you're the movement side as opposed to just sitting in front of a screen, from particularly early cognitive development. And yes, we were lucky in that we had the resources that we could afford not to have our kids in front of a TV while we were working. We could have somebody there working with them or put them in programs where they would have hands-on. But there was also something about minimizing that social distraction from an emotional development standpoint, where they're actually having to interact with other people live, which is not always comfortable. But I think in terms of skills that are going to be important for the future, that's going to be a really important one that can't be replaced. And I think, that's one of the risks that we're seeing with social media is there is that abstraction of handling difficult things face to face. So there were a number of reasons around that why we made the decision to minimize screen time so that they could actually go through that process. Oh, the other part of it was part of the Waldorf education, which really resonated with me is when a student is working on a problem, they have them struggle with it for a day or two, work through it. Like if there's a scientific problem, they'll show them the result or what happened, and they'll have to come up with their own hypothesis, think through it, and then come back in and either build the thing or get the answer to it, right? Which is really different than giving a kid the immediate answer. So in that case, they get to the solution faster, but they haven't struggled to think through like the critical thought process of getting there. That approach, I think, is even more important today, where even if you're trying to understand AI, spend the time to think through the process that you're going to go through and what you think the answer is before you go to AI. One that gives you a much better appreciation of what the tool can do, but it also ensures that you're staying on top of it and you're not giving sort of that critical part of it over to someone else, right? Which is really the thing that you should own as the manager or the worker. So that was part of what resonated with me with that approach, with keeping the kids off technology and then introducing technology at the right time and in the right way.
So, as you mentioned, a lot of tech execs in Silicon Valley do this approach. How do you manage that tension of doing your day job, building technology, and kind of with your kids then limiting their use of technology? And how do you decide when is the right time to expose them to that?
I mean, it's hard. I mean, the hardest part is if they're in an environment where everybody else is on it, right? Because then they feel like they're left out and that they're behind and so forth. So that's a tough thing as a parent, which to tell your kid no on something that they really want, or if they feel like they don't understand this TV show or something that's happening. Um, but that passes, right? And the kids now laugh at it, and we have jokes about things that they don't know, or like their whole like TV shows that they've missed, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of funny. Like at one point, I think one of my kids didn't know who Mickey Mouse was or something, and I'm like, ooh, I missed that one. But as a parent, you do the best you can, right? So that's kind of how I looked at it. Every family does things different. Some families have different religions, other have different styles of teaching. And from the reconciling what I was doing at work and what I was doing, at home, I mean, I do believe that at a certain point in time, technology is a great accelerator, right? It's a great learning aid. So I have no issue with technology at the right time and in the right place. And that was really a timing issue of like, when did the kids get their phone? When were they allowed on to different bits of social media? Because you do want them to have an on-ramp so they can use it responsibly.
Yeah.
So, there was that management when they left 8th grade and they went into high school. What did that transition look like? But what we found is at that point, their love of creating and drawing and sketching and reading was pretty well ingrained. So they were set with that, and then they could layer some of the other things on top. Um, there are cases where that adjustment can be hard, but in most cases, it seemed that by about 8th or 9th grade, the kids were ready for that transition into more technology. I think that the one challenge is, and we've seen the same thing with women in technology, right? Or girls in technology, is when you have, particularly boys who are growing up playing video games, they hit the high school ages and they feel really comfortable sliding into that computer science or that technology class because essentially they've been on technology since a young age playing whichever game. So it's then hard for somebody from the outside who doesn't have that to come in and feel comfortable in that environment. So I think there is a way to think about how do you develop those technical skills and capacities, and it's partly the schooling too, so that kids that haven't come up from that background feel comfortable.
Yeah. I guess there's like the skills and confidence, and there's also probably the language and the belonging and that kind of stuff, right? Like some of it is technical, but some of it is social and human.
Yeah. And there's a counter to it, right? Without making gross generalizations, I think a lot of times girls tend to have deeper, tighter social circles. So the idea of, you know, the typical, like the boy is on computer games in the basement playing. And I met parents who are like, my kids are downstairs on computer games all the time. And I'm like, I don't know what to say to that, but you allow them to do that. And they're down there and they become antisocial. They don't have as many friends at school because they just want to get home. And that's in a reinforcing cycle. So I think you end up with people that have high social skills and lower technical skills, and on the other side, high tech skills, but maybe lower social skills. And what I see with AI is those social skills and those things that make us uniquely human are going to become more important in the future. And the technical skills are becoming more accessible to more people than they have been before as coding and programming and AI helps to accelerate that. So that's where I see a potential shift, and maybe the barriers on the technical side coming down, so it will become more accessible to more people.
So your kids are now in their early 20s, and you mentioned they're liberal arts students, so they have more of those human skills. There's a lot of articles right now around how difficult it is in the job market. So do you see that your kids have the skills that are more in demand, or do you feel that it's a bit too early for that to have properly worked through the labor market yet?
It's interesting. In the case of my kids, they seem to be doing okay. And I think that's because they are quite comfortable socially and intellectually. So if you want to like engage them in a thoughtful current discussion on politics or literature or anything else, they're primed and ready to go. Right. So I think the challenge then is how do you marry that with what's happening with technology? Right. So I think some of their background, they're pretty comfortable with change and being adaptable, which I think is one of the things that so if you're stuck in a very structured way and your workplace is changing or there's change coming in 6 or 12 months, that can be devastating and paralyzing.
Yeah.
So the challenge I see for my kids and other, younger people like them is how do you adopt to technology? How do you understand AI? How do you integrate it in a responsible way? So I actually think there's a good opportunity right now for that younger generation to come in with AI skills so that they can help introduce AI to the company or to the workplace, which doesn't require deep technical understanding, but just enough of that understanding of how it can be applied in different situations. And I think there's an opportunity for them to come in and actually be that person at a company that is that AI lead or the AI champion. So that's my advice to the kids now is one, you've got to be comfortable presenting and standing up and doing those things that, that a leader or manager does. But if you can also be the one who introduces the company to how AI works or explains these things, you're going to be super valuable. And they also have the advantage that there's a perception that the younger generation is more digitally savvy than the older generation, which is probably true, but I do find it's not black and white. So I think, it's sort of like, and also because Gen AI is so new that a young person can learn quickly what's happening. Whereas for the older managers, it's also new, right? So not nobody, but very few people have 2 decades of AI experience that they can bring to their particular workplace. So this is an area where if you are technically savvy, you can take that information, you can assimilate it, and then you can apply that to a workplace. And I think that's a very valuable positioning for somebody who's young.
You've shared with me that some of the friends of your kids who've also studied liberal arts now live in Brooklyn, I think, kind of almost have a counter movement though to the whole AI world and are going much more analog again, reading books, physical books, going shopping and cooking from first principles and stuff like that. Where do you think this is coming from? And do you feel that that's something that's going to stop them from progressing throughout their career? Or do you feel like almost on the opposite, that will allow them to focus down on the more human side, which will be much more?
I think it's the latter. I thought about our earlier conversation, and I think it's not necessarily a rejection of AI, it's more a focus on authenticity. And I
Yeah.
think part of what I'm seeing is, there's an appreciation for what humans can do, whether it's art or woodworking or knitting or cooking. So that's part of it. I think, the cooking space is actually really interesting because I'm seeing a lot of my kids and their friends wanting to cook. I think that's also around community. And I think with that comes in things that are happening politically. So the idea of what are those things you can control,
Yeah.
right? So I can read a physical book, I can take it with me, I can cook something, I can, my son loves woodworking and he did an internship in New York with metalworking where he was like working with his hands and creating stuff. And I think that's very fulfilling and concrete in a world where there's so much change. Right. Because again, these kids are also coming out of COVID. Right. So I think it's not just AI, it's COVID, and it's a whole there's a whole world of change and risk and even the political and global change over the last several years, right? So if you're a young person coming out into the workforce, you're hearing all these things about, jobs decreasing, what's happening politically. So I just think there's a massive amount of uncertainty that they're dealing with, so that there is a kind of an anchoring of taking charge and doing things manually and physically. And some of it is environmental too. So things around, cutting back on fast food, vintage shopping, which is both kind of cool and fashion, but I think it's also a statement of why would we buy into fast fashion when we can go to a vintage store and get cooler stuff? And it's a communal experience doing that.
Do you think that's like a general across that generation, or is that the fortunate few who can afford to be a bit more disconnected?
I don't think it's a fortunate. I don't think it's an economic issue, because I think there are plenty of people who do that because they don't have means, so they're going to a vintage clothing store. I you know Part of what I have realized is living in Silicon Valley for as long as I have. I'm out of touch with some of what happens in the rest of the country. So at one point years ago, when the kids were younger, I took them for an out of the bubble tour. So we started off in New Orleans and drove to Austin, which those were still kind of in the bubble, but every place in between that we drove to and stopped off and ate at gas stations and took our time to do that, just to get a sense of what other parts of the country were actually looking like and thinking. And we had some amazing experiences with people who had very different political views.
Yeah.
But the kid said that was the nicest couple that I've ever met. One woman we were at a bed and breakfast, and one woman is like, to my daughter, darling, you've got a sore throat. I've got the best throat lozenge. And she walked 6 blocks home to get it and came back. And the kids are like, no one would ever do that, right? So
Yeah.
they're like realizations about people and so forth. But that's a long way of saying I don't know how prevalent that is. I do see it in the major cities, and I see it among their friends, but I don't have the data on what's happening in other parts of the country.
And do you feel generally optimistic around where AI is going when you think about the future of your kids?
That's a great question. I try to define myself as a rational optimist. So I think I feel positive for who they are as humans and how they look at the world. So I think they're in about as good a position as they can. It's sort of like if you're coming on to play a new sport, if you're fit and you kind of know how sports work, you can be adaptable. So I've seen a lot of kids be able to be adaptable. I've also seen other kids that haven't started to thrive and are going through serious issues around social emotional issues. And it's unclear who and how it will affect. And I think that's one of the things that's been interesting for me is when I'm talking with, parents of kids, the same age, there's some kids who are doing great and there are some kids who aren't. And even within the same family, you'll see differences in those two. So it's really hard to know how it's gonna affect people. And I think a lot of it is, we're seeing it in the workplace too. One of the biggest challenges I see is just that threat to identity.
Yeah.
Who am I? What's my opportunity? This is who I thought I was, and that's not who I'm going to have to be, or that's not valued, or it's being replaced. But I think that's an issue across the age spectrum.
Yeah, I have a surprisingly large number of conversations again around mindset and the growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And as you say, do I feel this is an opportunity for me or as a threat to me? And depending on which side of that I fall down on, I'm either going to be able to benefit from it, or because if it is a threat to my identity, I will try and avoid it. And then at some point, it will be to my detriment.
I think that is the most important part of this whole discussion for kids and also for adults in AI is the concept of growth mindset. As an aside, we were playing categories, and I don't know if you know categories. You have a category and you have to pick in this case, it was a book that began with an author whose name began with like D. And
Right.
my son and I both picked Carol Dweck, who wrote the book Growth Mindset like 20 years ago. And I'm like,
Yeah.
what are the chances of that, right? Because he was studying that in college and I was using it for my work. And, I look at it as the derivative of the growth mindset is the AI mindset around curiosity, resilience, and experimentation, right? And if somebody comes into a situation with those three characteristics, they're going to be fine, right? So I think that's really the key right now is how do you get comfortable with accelerated change? How do you thrive in that situation? And how do you make decisions with very limited knowledge, whether you're starting your career or you're a CEO? And I really feel for CEOs that have come up in a very traditional way. And all of a sudden, the assumptions and the strategies they've used in the past are very, very different from what's happening now.
Well, that's kind of interesting. I think kind of, what was it, about 20 years ago, there was this concept of VUCA, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And we stopped talking about this again, I think probably 18 years ago, but it seems like it's more relevant than ever. There must be some of those stories to pick up again around what is really helpful. How do you navigate a world that is changing so much faster than ever before?
Yeah. So part of my work has evolved over the last 6 months to working more with executive search professionals who are doing CEO searches and so forth. And there's a whole discussion around what are the new competencies that CEOs and C-suite leaders are going to need in a world of AI, where for exactly those reasons, right? Things are changing faster and there are more variables coming in than we ever expected. And it's not just AI, right? You've got climate change, you've got tariffs, you've got just across the board, things are changing. So you need to lead differently. And a lot of that, I think, is really around being able to have authentic conversations, right? Because I've seen a lot of leaders who are used to having all the answers, and you're not going to have all the answers, and you're going to be vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
So being able to lead, and it sounds like a very, Bay Area, California concept, but to be able to lead with imperfect information while still being authentic and vulnerable, I think is a really difficult thing for a lot of people to do.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the characteristics that companies are going to have to hire for are people who both have the understanding of how to lead in uncertainty, but at the same time have enough technical understanding to figure out how they work AI and agents into a workforce, right? So
Yeah.
and in that, right, there's a whole other like empathy for humans and employees, and how do you have those conversations with people whose jobs may be changing, but you don't necessarily know how or what speed they're going to be changing. So I think the balancing those two things may not exist in one person. So it might be a team that you need to assemble that can do that. But I think that's something we're going to be hearing a lot more about.
Yeah, we're having quite a lot of internal conversation at the moment around what are the no regret moves that we need to do no matter what in a world
Yeah,
that is hard to predict.
that's an interesting concept.
Thank you so much, Matt. And maybe just one last question. In 10 years' time, AI will have allowed you to spend more time with your kids. In what way?
At that point, my kids will be their early 30s, right? And they may have families of their own. So I would hope that AI could help us be more intentional and prioritize family and time together, and maybe do that in a way that was exciting and best for everybody in the family. Because one of the things we started doing is having a family vacation each year where everybody has come together, and which has been wonderful. But doing that in a way that works well for everybody and is compelling and we can block time for it would be my hope, right? I mean, that's really at the end, the positive vision of AI is if it allows us to do those things where we can connect with people, not necessarily spending time in a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint deck. So if we can come together in an intentional way that we prioritize that, and if AI could help facilitate that, that would be awesome.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt.
It's been a pleasure.